this story now, the debate over autonomous weapons, now moving from what these technologies can do to what governments should allow them to do. The International Committee of the Red Cross is urging states to agree on clear legal limits, arguing that human judgment and accountability must remain at the center of decisions to use force. With governments due to meet in Geneva in November, there is renewed pressure to move from years of discussion towards a binding international agreement. For more on this, we're joined now by Georgia Hinds, a legal advisor with the International Committee of the Red Cross. Georgia, welcome to Channel Africa and Rise and Shine. Thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you for having me on.
So let's just start with the context. What is the bigger picture that we're looking at? What has been the evolution of autonomous weapons? That brings it down to the layman's person so that they can understand what we're talking about.
Sure. So, I mean, there's no internationally agreed definition of an autonomous weapon, but the generally accepted characterization is basically a weapon that on its own, without human intervention, will select and engage a target. And we do already have systems that meet this definition, so things like anti-missile defense systems. But if we look to the future, what we can anticipate coming down the pipeline, we see a push to greater autonomy in things like loitering munitions, in complex swarming technologies, and coupling that with what we're seeing on the ground in conflicts, which is ongoing levels of widespread and indiscriminate devastation in some of the conflicts where we have the highest levels of technological sophistication. And I think this really brings us cause for concern and is part of the urgency that's behind this renewed call in the joint appeal.
So, and just in terms of what the debate has been about whether or not, because depending on who you listen to, AI is a threat or is it a threat that we're never going to have a situation where humans are not involved in making these all-important decisions? Has there been evidence that this is an eventuality or something that could happen?
I think that increasingly we're seeing public reporting, trends that are being highlighted by developers of these systems about what they're capable of. Whether or not they're being used that way is always very difficult to verify for us, or I would say for anyone. What we're currently concerned about with them, though, is the way in which these systems have the potential to reduce a human's ability to control their effects, control the use of force in an attack. And that really poses a challenge for commanders' ability to make a judgment about whether an attack will be lawful. It also is a fundamental ethical concern, because once you have a life and death decision that is effectively delegated to a machine, or as you've highlighted, to an AI system, that's a fundamentally dehumanizing process for the victim, and it removes moral agency and accountability there. In terms of the discussions to date, and you mentioned that states will be meeting in November, and that's really the critical reason why we've renewed this call now, because states have been discussing this issue for over 10 years in Geneva in the group of governmental experts, and they've been very clear about the risks that are posed by these technologies. So I think that is not up for debate. The challenge is now moving what the group of governmental experts has put on paper. They have a text, moving that into action and creating a legally binding instrument. And that's what they have the chance to do in November at the review conference.
So is there
to launch these formal negotiations of a new treaty, and that will only occur every 5 years.
All right, sorry to interrupt you there. I think the line just went silent, but we'll come back to that, what can happen at an international, multilateral level. But is there a formula just in terms of the level of human control that there should be over a weapon before it is used for potentially lethal decisions?
So it's not exactly a threshold. The idea of human control is that basically you have to have a structure in place that allows humans to be making these judgments in armed conflict and complying with international humanitarian law. And the way that we have recommended that states can achieve this is by prohibiting certain autonomous weapons, so particularly the autonomous weapons that pose the greatest risk to civilians, and that would be an unpredictable autonomous weapon, so one that incorporates AI that is so complex, for instance, that a human can't understand or predict how it would function. Also, prohibiting the use against people, particularly because that's a very risky category of targets in armed conflict. The status of a person can change very quickly in armed conflict. And then once you've ruled out those problematic systems, you put in place restrictions on how the rest are operated. So that's limiting the area over which they operate, the time, the types of targets, and things like that. And it's this layered effect that allows humans to achieve the control that's needed. So it's not an exact threshold, but it requires all of these measures. And states have actually put these measures into the draft text that they're considering. So we see a good structure there of prohibitions coupled with restrictions on other systems.
Thus far, what have you seen as the barriers to states agreeing on binding, restrictions or even prohibitions in some cases, as they've said?
Mm-hmm. I think that there is a challenge generally with international disarmament discussions and diplomacy that it does tend to move quite slowly. You put a lot of lawyers in a room and they do tend to take a long time to come to an agreement. And when you couple that with the pace at which technology is advancing, you can sometimes end up with a mismatch. And that's what we're very concerned about. I think that we really need to see political will and political courage at this stage to take this next step and to commit to binding prohibitions and restrictions. And I think that there is a strong majority of voices in this group that is calling for these limits, and they need to make themselves heard, including the Africa group, which actually made a joint statement at the beginning of this year in March to this forum, and saying that they were ready to move to negotiations and that they were happy with the text and were keen to move forward. So we need that kind of leadership to be shown in these forums.
So you have pointed to the November review conference of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons as a potential turning point. Who's going to be there, and why do you have such hope that there could be an about turn there?
So that will include all parties to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, and that is 128 states. So it's quite a significant number of states, and it includes all large military powers as well. And so in terms of why this represents such a key opportunity, well, this is the first time that we have a clear text to work on. And as I said, this is essentially the review conference that happens every 5 years. And so this is the key chance for states to take this decision to move to negotiations. They've done the work, they've done the substantive drafting. What it will take now is to turn that into a binding instrument. And I think that also political pressure from the public is mounting as we see more and more reporting about these kinds of weapons being potentially used in armed conflicts around the world. So when you look at what the general public is asking for, they are actually calling on their governments to set limits now before it's too late to take that preventative action.
Okay, and just finally, what kind of commitments are you hoping for, and are there any particular countries that are leading the cause that you can look to make sure that, or at least speak to them and say, look, we would really love you to help us lead this cause?
Well, there's a very clear group of states. So in the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, as I said, the African group has made a very clear statement this year that they are willing to move to negotiations and calling on the group to do that. And we would encourage them to continue to make their strong voices heard. There was also a very similar call in September last year by 42 states, including some African states, Lesotho, Sierra Leone, Cameroon, and others, that said a very similar thing. And so what we're trying to do is bring all those voices together, because that does constitute already a clear majority in this forum. And so I think rather than relying on one or two states here or there, it's actually better to be highlighting that many states have come together, including some of those that will be the most affected if these weapons are rolled out, and to be highlighting that they are actually expecting the international community to take action and to commit to binding rules that will set clear norms, as we've seen with other weapons treaties that continue to set clear norms, the Chemical Weapons Convention, among others. And so that's the kind of thing that we're expecting from states. We're urging them, as the joint call said, to seize this moment because it's the clearest path available that we've had.
And is there anything that, should it not happen, you'd consider the summit a failure?
Well, I think that if states do not decide to launch these negotiations and instead, for instance, they agree to just continue discussions indefinitely, I think for us we would have to really question whether this forum is working because, as I said, these discussions have been occurring for nearly 13 years now. And so at the time they were quite ahead of the curve. Now I think they are really struggling to keep pace, and preventative action is definitely best. We did this when it came to blinding laser weapons. There was a protocol negotiated on that. The technology was not developed. So we have this key window, but it's much harder once the technology is developed and deployed to then roll it back. And so we really don't want to miss this moment, and that for us would be a failure, not responding now to the challenges that even industry are pointing out, the challenges with things like complex AI systems, and for them to be saying this, chief AI scientists, and for us not to listen as the international community, this would be a failure for future generations and for civilians who are already suffering in armed conflicts, I think.
Well, we do thank you for your time and sharing that insights with us. Georgia Hinds, a legal advisor with the International Committee of the Red Cross, speaking to us about the need for legally binding international rules on autonomous weapons and the importance of keeping human judgment and accountability at the center of decisions to use lethal force in particular. And that brings us to just about 8 o'clock. We're going to kick off the third and final hour of